Elias was not the kind of man anyone looked at twice. He was small, with shoulders that were slightly rounded from years of bending over to scrub floors or pick up trash. He worked as a janitor at the big university in the center of the city. It was a job that kept him invisible. Students rushed past him with their heads full of exams and future careers. The professors walked by with their noses in the air. To them, Elias was just part of the building. Like the old radiator that clanked in the winter, or the flickering lights in the hallway. But Elias didn't mind being invisible. It meant he could watch the world without being bothered. When his shift ended, Elias didn't go home to sit in front of the television. He went to his small garden behind the apartment building where he lived. It was a patch of dirt that wasn't much bigger than a rug, but to Elias, it was magic. He grew tomatoes that were red and heavy, basil that smelled like summer, and carrots that were sweet and crunchy. He knew exactly when to pick them. He didn't need a calendar or a book to tell him. He could just look at a plant and know it was ready. Elias loved to cook. He didn't cook like the people on the fancy cooking shows with their expensive machines and their strange words. He cooked the way his mother taught him and the way her mother taught her. He used his hands. He used his nose. He believed that food was love, and if you cooked with anger or hurry, the food would taste bad. But if you cooked with patience and kindness, the food would make people feel happy inside. One afternoon, Elias was sweeping the floors in the university cafeteria when he saw a colorful poster taped to the wall. It was for the City Harvest Cook-Off. It was a big contest held every year in the town square. Chefs from fancy restaurants would come and cook their best dishes. There was a prize of $5,000 for the winner. Elias stared at the poster. $5,000 was a lot of money. It was more than he made in months. He thought about the library at the local elementary school. The library was old, the shelves were falling apart, and there were hardly any new books for the kids to read. Elias loved to read. It made him sad to see the children with nothing new to learn from. He decided right then that he would enter the contest. He would use the prize money to fix up the library. The day of the contest was bright and sunny. The town square was crowded with people. There were booths set up everywhere, and the smell of grilling meat and fresh bread filled the air. Elias arrived early, carrying his big pot and a bag of vegetables from his garden. He felt nervous. His clothes were clean but old. He wore a simple white shirt that he had ironed carefully and dark pants. While the other contestants were setting up their fancy gas stoves and arranging their gleaming silver knives, Elias just set up his small electric burner. It looked very plain next to the high-tech equipment. Everyone else had. At the station right next to his stood a man named Victor. Victor was a famous chef. He owned a restaurant that was so expensive you had to book a table 3 months in advance. He wore a pristine white uniform with a tall white hat. He had 2 assistants helping him unpack boxes of exotic ingredients, truffles, imported oils, and cuts of meat that probably cost more than Elias's car. Victor looked over at Elias and frowned. He watched as Elias took out a cutting board that was worn smooth from years of use. He watched Elias pull a head of garlic and a bunch of carrots out of a reused canvas bag. "What is this?" Victor asked, pointing his expensive knife at Elias's vegetables. His voice was loud, and he laughed as he spoke it. Elias looked up, startled. "I am making a beef stew," Elias said softly. "It is my mother's recipe." Victor laughed again, louder this time. A few people nearby turned to look. "A stew?" Victor shook his head in disbelief. "You call this a competition? This is a charity event, not a soup kitchen. You think that pile of vegetables can beat my cuisine?" Elias felt his face get hot. "It is good food," he said. "People like it." "People like what?" a reporter asked, walking over with a cameraman. She wanted to film Victor because he was famous, but she saw the commotion. She pointed her microphone at them. "This man," Victor said, gesturing at Elias like he was a bad joke, "thinks he is a chef. Look at his station. He has no garnish. He has no technique. He is just going to boil meat and vegetables. It is sad, really. It insults the profession." The cameraman zoomed in on Elias's hands. Elias was just chopping an onion. He did it fast and rhythmically. Chop, chop, chop. It is simple cooking, Elias said, trying to keep his voice steady. Simple does not mean bad.
Ah!
In this world, simple means lazy, Victor said, turning back to his own station. He began arranging tiny green leaves on a plate with a pair of tweezers. Food must be complex. It must be an experience. You are just making fuel for pigs. A few people in the crowd laughed. They didn't mean to be cruel, but they were following Victor's lead. He was the famous one, after all. He was the expert. Elias was just a janitor with a pot of stew. Elias wanted to pack up his things and go home. He felt small. He felt like he didn't belong. But then he looked past the crowd. He saw some of the children from the neighborhood standing near the front. They were watching the cooking with wide eyes. He remembered why he was there. He remembered the library. He took a deep breath. He reminded himself that the food doesn't care who is laughing. The food only cares about the love you put into it. He turned his back on the crowd. He focused on the pot. He poured in a little olive oil and let it get warm. He added the beef seasoned only with salt and pepper, and listened to the satisfying sizzle as it browned. The smell started to rise up. It wasn't the smell of fancy chemicals or rare spices. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of comfort. Victor kept talking to the reporter. He explained his concept for the day, which involved deconstructing a salad and putting it back together with a foam made from soy. He used big words that the reporter nodded at. Every time he paused, he would look over at Elias and make a face, pretending to fan away a bad smell. "Can you smell that?" Victor asked the camera. "That is the smell of mediocrity. That is what happens when people have no ambition."
Oh.
But the reporter sniffed the air. She frowned slightly. She didn't smell anything bad. She smelled something rich and savory. Her stomach actually gave a tiny rumble. But she ignored it because she was supposed to be listening to the famous chef. Elias kept working. He added the onions and garlic, letting them turn soft and sweet. He added the carrots and celery, the classic foundation of flavor. He poured in water and some red wine he had bought with his own money. He lowered the heat and put the lid on. Now came the hard part, waiting. While the other chefs were running around, plating things and shouting orders, Elias just stood by his pot. He stirred it gently every few minutes. He tasted the liquid and adjusted the salt. He was in his own world. Victor was getting more and more agitated. He liked attention. He wasn't getting enough attention because people were starting to look curiously at Elias's pot. The smell was getting stronger. It was drifting through the square, cutting through the smell of Victor's fancy perfumes and oils. "Look at him," Victor sneered, his voice rising so everyone could hear. "He is doing nothing. He is just standing there. A real chef creates. A real chef innovates. This man is boring. He is wasting our time." Some people in the crowd shook their heads. They agreed with Victor. Cooking looked like hard work, like something that should be fast and flashy. Elias looked too calm. He looked too peaceful. It didn't look like a competition to them. It looked like a Sunday afternoon at Grandma's house. But then Victor lifted the lid off his own dish to add a final touch. The steam rose up, and he leaned over it. Suddenly he coughed. He had added too much pepper, and the cloud of spice hit him in the face. His eyes watered. He tried to cover it up, but he dropped his spoon. It clattered loudly on the ground. His assistant scrambled to clean it up. In the silence that followed the clatter, the only sound was the gentle bubbling of Elias's stew. The reporter looked at Victor, who was wiping his eyes and trying to look dignified. And then she looked at Elias. Elias was just stirring his pot. He didn't look at Victor. He didn't smile. He just checked the clock. He knew the stew was almost ready. The meat would be tender now. The vegetables would be soft. The sauce would be thick. 10 minutes to judging. A voice announced over the loudspeaker. Victor pulled himself together. He put on his angry face again. He glared at Elias. "Enjoy your last moments of dignity, old man," he muttered, just loud enough for Elias to hear. "When the judges taste your slop next to my masterpiece, you will be run out of this town." Elias didn't answer. He didn't fight back. He just reached into his bag and pulled out a fresh bunch of parsley. He chopped it finely. He sprinkled the green confetti over the top of the stew. It looked beautiful in its simplicity. He wiped the rim of the pot with a clean cloth. He wasn't cooking to beat Victor. He wasn't cooking to prove he was a big shot. He was cooking for the kids who needed books. He was cooking for the memory of his mother. And most importantly, he was cooking because he knew that a hungry person doesn't care about concepts or deconstruction. They just want food that tastes good. The judges were walking toward their row now. They wore serious expressions. They held clipboards. They had already eaten a lot of strange, complicated food that morning, and none of it had satisfied them. They were tired. They were hungry. Victor stood tall, puffing out his chest, ready to explain his genius. Elias stood by his simple pot. Hands clasped in front of him, waiting. The air was thick with tension. The smell of the stew was undeniable now. It wasn't just Elias anymore. The people in the front row were sniffing the air. Even the reporter looked interested. The crowd parted slightly as the judges approached. First, they stopped at Victor's station. Then they would come to Elias. Elias took a deep breath. He wasn't nervous anymore. He knew what was in that pot. It wasn't just beef and carrots. It was time. It was patience. It was real. And in a world full of noise and showing off, real is a very powerful thing. The town square was buzzing with the sound of music and excited chatter. But the space between Elias's station and Victor's felt like a frozen block of ice. Victor was busy. He moved around his small kitchen space like a general commanding an army. His two assistants were scrambling to keep up. One was crushing ice with a silver machine. The other was carefully painting dark streaks of sauce onto long white plates. Every movement was sharp. Every movement was practiced. Victor was not just cooking. He was performing. Every few seconds, Victor would look over at Elias. He was looking for a crack in the armor. He wanted to see Elias sweating. He wanted to see Elias panic. But Elias was just standing there, watching his pot. Every now and then, he would lift the heavy wooden lid, peek inside, and give the stew a gentle stir. He would lower the lid again and wipe his hands on his white apron. He moved slowly, deliberately. To Victor, this slowness was annoying. It was an insult to the energy of the competition. You're putting the audience to sleep. Victor shouted over the noise of the blender. Cooking is a sport. It is an art. You act like you were waiting for a bus. A few people in the crowd laughed. They wanted to be on the side of the winner, and Victor looked like a winner. He had confidence. He had the fancy tools. He had the loud voice. Elias looked like a man who had wandered in by mistake. The reporter with the camera crew came back. She wanted more footage for the news. She pointed her microphone at Victor again. Tell us, she asked. What is the secret ingredient in your dish today? Victor smiled a smile that showed all his teeth. He held up a small glass bottle. It contained a golden liquid. This, he said, is saffron-infused oil. I imported it. It costs more than most people make in a week. And see this powder? This is gold dust, real gold. It is for the finish. People eat with their eyes first. My dish looks expensive because it is expensive. He turned his body so he was blocking the camera from seeing Elias. I am not worried about the competition. How can I be? Look at him. He is boiling a pot of brown mush. It is tragic, really. He thinks he can feed people with feelings, but feelings do not fill you up. Technique fills you up. Victor started laughing again. He looked at Elias and made a point of holding his nose with his fingers, pretending that Elias's food smelled terrible. The cameraman zoomed in on Victor's face, then panned quickly to Elias. Elias was looking down at his pot. He wasn't angry. He looked sad. It was the look of a man who sees someone being mean and doesn't understand why. He gently laid his wooden spoon on a clean cloth. It is ready, Elias whispered to himself. He didn't say it loud enough for anyone else to hear. Victor heard him anyway. Ready? Victor sneered. Ready to lose, you mean? Victor decided to turn up the heat. He wanted to make sure the judges knew that Elias was a joke before they even tasted the food. He stepped out from behind his table and walked right up to the edge of Elias's space. He was tall, and he used his height to look down on the smaller man. "I know people like you," Victor said, his voice dropping so only the people nearby could hear. He wanted to sound dangerous. "You think because you are poor, you are honest. You think because you are simple, you are good. But you are just lazy. You don't want to learn. You don't want to work. You just want sympathy. Well, this is a kitchen, not a hospital. No one cares about your story here." People standing nearby stopped talking. They watched to see what Elias would do. Would he yell? Would he throw something? Elias looked up. He looked Victor in the eye. "I am not lazy," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it was steady. "And this is not about me. It is about the food." "The food is garbage," Victor snapped. "Look at your station. It is dirty. You use the same spoon for everything. Where are your sanitizers? Where are your gloves? If I were a health inspector, I would shut you down." Victor raised his voice again, speaking to the crowd. "This man is a health hazard. He has no running water here. He has no fridge. Who knows how long that meat has been sitting out?" The crowd began to murmur. It was a good point. It was a hot day. The rules said you were supposed to keep cold foods cold. Elias had kept his meat in a cooler with ice until he was ready to cook it, but he didn't have a fancy display to prove it. "They will get sick eating his slop," Victor shouted, pointing at the pot. "Is that what you want for your town? Food poisoning." Elias felt a pang of fear in his chest. If people believed Victor, they wouldn't even taste the stew. If they didn't taste it, they couldn't love it. And if they didn't love it, he couldn't fix the library. "It is fresh," Elias said, louder than before. "I bought the meat this morning from Mr. Henderson's farm. I kept it on ice. It is safe. A farmer." Victor laughed, throwing his hands in the air. He bought it from a farmer. What does a farmer know about culinary standards? "I buy my meat from certified distributors in France. This is local trash." He turned to the judges, who were now watching the argument with serious faces. "Judges," Victor called out, "I object. My opponent is not following safety protocols. He is serving the public's will. It is an insult to this entire event." The head judge, a stern woman with silver hair and reading glasses low on her nose, looked over the rim of her spectacles. She didn't say anything yet. She just watched. She was old enough to know that the loudest person in the room isn't always the right one. Victor took the silence as permission to keep going. He was enjoying himself now. He felt powerful. He walked back to his own station and picked up a pair of silver tweezers. He used them to place a single, tiny leaf on top of his masterpiece. "Watch and learn," Victor said to the crowd. "This is how a professional presents food." He spent the next 5 minutes arranging his plates. He used a ruler to make sure the distance between the sauce and the meat was exactly the same on every plate. He wiped the rim of the plates with a vinegar cloth 3 times. It was precise. It was mathematical. It looked like a machine had made it. Meanwhile, Elias was getting ready too, but in a very different way. He took out a stack of thick ceramic bowls. They weren't fancy matching bowls. They were bowls he had used for years. Some had small chips in the rim. They were heavy and sturdy. He took a ladle, a big, deep spoon, and dipped it into the pot. He pulled up a spoonful of the stew. The steam rose up, thick and rich. The gravy was dark brown, glistening slightly. The chunks of beef were so tender they were falling apart. The carrots were bright orange. The potatoes were soft and white. Elias ladled the stew into the bowls. He didn't measure. He didn't use a ruler. He just filled the bowl until it looked like enough for a hungry person. Then he took a slice of thick, dark bread from a basket. He tore the bread, roughly no knife for him, and placed a piece on the side of each bowl. He sprinkled a little bit of fresh green parsley on top. That was it. Victor looked over and snorted. "Look at that," he told his assistant. "He serves it in dog bowls, and he tears the bread with his hands. He has no class. He is an animal." But the wind was shifting. The smell coming from Elias's station was getting stronger. It was the smell of roasted meat and thyme and slow-cooked onions. It was a smell that bypassed your nose and went straight to your stomach. The people in the front row were breathing in deeply. They didn't look at Victor's pretty plates anymore. They were looking at the stew. Even the reporter felt it. She looked at her cameraman and mouthed the words, "I am hungry." The loudspeakers crackled. "Judging will begin in 1 minute. Chefs, prepare your samples." Victor sprang into action. He lined up his 5 plates on a silver tray. He adjusted the lighting on his table so the gold dust on the food would sparkle. He checked his reflection in a mirror to make sure his hat was straight. He was convinced he had already won. He had humiliated the competition. He had shown the crowd what real skill looked like. Elias stood by his bowls. There were 5 of them sitting on a simple metal tray. He wasn't checking his reflection. He wasn't checking the lighting. He was just checking the food. He wanted to make sure it was hot enough. Not burning hot, but hot enough to feel good in your belly. Victor walked over one last time. He leaned in close, so his face was inches from Elias's. "I am going to enjoy watching you lose," Victor whispered. "I hope you cry on camera. It will make great TV." Elias looked at him. For the first time, a small smile touched the corner of Elisa's mouth. It wasn't a happy smile, and it wasn't a mean smile. It was just a smile of knowing. "The food has no ego," Elias said softly. "It just is." Victor rolled his eyes. "What is that supposed to mean?" "You and your riddles. Get out of my way." Victor marched toward the judges' table with his head high, holding the silver tray like it was the crown jewels. The crowd clapped politely. They clapped because they were supposed to. Elias picked up his metal tray. It was heavier than Victor's. He walked toward the judges' table. His steps were slow. He didn't look left or right. He just looked at the table where the 5 judges sat. As he walked, a silence seemed to follow him. The crowd watched the simple man with the heavy tray. They watched the steam rising from the bowls. They smelled the deep, rich aroma that surrounded him. The reporter lowered her microphone. She stopped looking at her notes. The cameraman forgot to zoom. He just kept the camera rolling, capturing the scene. Victor was already talking to the judges, using big words to describe his deconstructed landscape and his saffron-infused essence. The judges were nodding, looking at the beautiful plate. But their eyes kept sliding past Victor. They kept looking at the man standing behind him, waiting his turn. The head judge looked up. "Next," she said. Victor stepped aside, a smug look on his face. He thought the hard part was over. He thought the competition was just a formality now. He moved to the side to watch Elias fail. Elias placed the metal tray on the table. One by one, he set the heavy ceramic bowls in front of the judges. The smell hit them instantly. It wasn't a smell that could be ignored. It was warm and inviting. It smelled like a rainy Sunday afternoon. It smelled like safety. The judges looked at the bowls. There was no foam. There was no gold dust. There was no arrangement. Just chunks of meat and vegetables and a dark, savory sauce. With a piece of torn bread soaking up the liquid on the side, Elias didn't say a word about his technique. He didn't tell them about the wine or the fresh herbs. He didn't brag about his mother's recipe. He just stepped back and clasped his hands behind his back, waiting. The head judge picked up her spoon. She looked at Victor, then she looked at Elias. She looked at the complicated, cold dish in front of her, and then at the hot, steaming stew. For a moment, the square was completely silent. The only sound was the wind rustling the banner above them. Then, the judge took a bite. The head judge, a stern woman with silver hair who had seen thousands of dishes in her career, brought the spoon to her lips. She didn't just sip. She took a proper bite, getting a piece of the beef and a bit of carrot on the spoon. As soon as the food touched her tongue, something changed in her face. The tightness around her eyes softened. She stopped chewing for a split second, her eyebrows raising just a little. She swallowed, and a look of genuine surprise washed over her. She didn't say anything immediately. She just looked down into the bowl, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then she took another bite. This time, She closed her eyes for a moment. Beside her, the other judges were doing the same. One judge, a young man known for loving spicy and modern food, took a big spoonful. He gasped quietly. It wasn't a bad gasp. It was the sound you make when you find something you didn't know you were looking for. The beef was so tender, it didn't need chewing. It fell apart in his mouth. The sauce was thick, not from flour, but from the long, slow cooking of the meat and vegetables. It tasted of the earth, of the fresh herbs Elias had grown, and of the care he had put into it. It was a simple flavor, but it was deep. It was the kind of taste that reminds you of being a child and coming inside from the cold to a warm house. It was honest. Victor stood to the side, watching closely. His arms were crossed over his chest. He was waiting for the grimace. He was waiting for the judges to spit it out or ask for water. But the grimace never came. Instead, he saw the head judge reach for the piece of torn bread. She dipped it into the salsa, messy, informal thing to do, and took a bite. She actually smiled. The silence at the judge's table was heavy, but it wasn't an angry silence. It was a respectful one. The judge next to her, a man who wrote for a famous food magazine, finally put his spoon down. He looked at Elias, then looked at Victor, then looked back at Elias. "This," the magazine judge said, pointing his spoon at the bowl, "is extraordinary." Victor uncrossed his arms. He stepped forward, his face turning red. "Excuse me? It is boiled meat. Anybody can do that. It is peasant food." The head judge held up her hand to silence him. She didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes on Elias. "Young man," she said to Victor, her voice sharp and cutting through the air. "Anybody can boil meat? Yes, but not everybody can make it taste like this." She wiped her mouth with a napkin and turned her attention to Elias. "Tell us about the time," she asked. "Is it dried?" Elias shook his head. "No, ma'am. It is fresh. From my garden. I picked it this morning, and the beef. It is from a farm just outside the city. The cow ate grass, not corn. It makes a big difference," Elias said simply. He didn't use fancy words. He just spoke the truth. The judges nodded. They knew about grass-fed beef. It was expensive and hard to get, but here it was, sitting in a simple bowl. Treated with respect rather than complicated science. The head judge turned to Victor's plate. She had only taken one bite of it earlier. She looked at the beautiful arrangement. The gold dust was glittering under the sun. The foam was still holding its shape. It looked perfect. "Chef Victor," she said, "your dish is technically flawless. The plating is art. The saffron oil is present." "Thank you," Victor said, puffing out his chest. "It represents the future of food," perhaps the judge said. She picked up her fork and took another bite of his dish. She chewed slowly. She looked thoughtful. "But tell me, what is the point of it?" "The point?" Victor asked, confused. "The point," she said, setting her fork down loudly. "The soul. I taste pepper. I taste oil. I taste the foam. I taste the gold, which tastes like nothing at all. But I do not taste you. I do not feel anything when I eat it. It is cold. It is smart, but it is empty." The crowd gasped. They had never heard the judges speak this way to a famous chef. Victor's face went from red to white. "Empty. It is complex. It is sophisticated." "Sophistication is not a flavor," the judge replied firmly. "And complexity is not a virtue if it does not result in pleasure." She pushed Victor's plate away slightly. She picked up her spoon for Elias's stew again. "This bowl," she said, "is not complex, but it has pleasure in every bite. It nourishes. It comforts. It tastes like honesty." She looked around at the other judges. "Are we in agreement?" One by one, they nodded. The young spicy food judge actually scraped the bottom of his bowl to get the last bit of sauce. He looked embarrassed, but he couldn't help it. It was just that good. Victor looked like he had been slapped. He looked at his masterpiece, which suddenly looked very silly next to the empty bowls of stew. He looked at Elias. Elias was still standing there quietly, his hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He just looked relieved that they liked it. "This is ridiculous," Victor sputtered. He turned to the crowd. "They don't understand art. They are too simple to understand my vision." The reporter stepped closer. Her camera was rolling, capturing every moment of Victor's breakdown. "Chef," she asked, "what do you have to say about the judge's comments?" Victor opened his mouth to shout, to make excuses, to blame the heat or the ingredients, but the words wouldn't come. He looked at the head judge's stern face. He looked at the empty bowls. He looked at Elias, standing calm and tall. For the first time in a long time, Victor felt small. He felt like a bully who had finally met someone stronger than him. He realized then that his gold dust was just dust. His foam was just air. And Elias's simple stew was the real deal. He had spent years trying to impress people with tricks. While Elias had spent years trying to feed people with love, Victor didn't answer the reporter. He just turned around, walked back to his station, and began packing his things. He threw his silver spoons into the box. He tossed the expensive oils into his bag. He didn't care anymore. He just wanted to leave. The loudspeaker crackled again. "The judges have reached a decision." The announcer's voice boomed across the square. The crowd went quiet. Everyone leaned forward. The mothers held their children close. The people in the back stood on their tiptoes. The head judge stood up. She walked to the microphone at the front of the stage. She held a piece of paper in her hand. She looked out at the sea of faces. "We have tasted many wonderful dishes today," she began. "Cooking is a hard job. It requires passion. Today we saw passion in two very different forms." She paused for effect. One chef showed us passion for perfection, for the future, for the image of food. She looked directly at Victor, who was hiding behind his station. The other cook, she continued, her voice softening, showed us passion for the ingredients, for the history of food, for the people eating it. She looked at Elias. In a world that is always rushing, always trying to be newer and faster, it is rare to find someone who takes the time to do things the right way. Today, we were not looking for the fanciest dish. We were looking for the best dish, and we found it. She took a deep breath. The suspense was unbearable. "The winner of the City Harvest Cook-Off," she announced, "is Elias and his rustic beef stew." For a second, there was total silence. Then the noise exploded. It wasn't just clapping. It was cheering. It was shouting. The crowd surged forward. People were whistling and stomping their feet. Elias stood there, blinking. He couldn't believe it. He looked at the judge to make sure he heard her right. She nodded at him and smiled a warm, genuine smile. She handed him the giant check. $5,000? Elias took the check. His hands were shaking a little bit. He looked at the numbers. It was real. Victor watched from the shadows. He saw Elias holding the check. He saw the crowd cheering for the man he had called a peasant. He felt a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a hollow feeling. He felt empty. He realized that no amount of gold, dust, or fame could buy the kind of love Elias was getting right then. Elias turned to the crowd. He didn't wave like a politician. He just held the check against his chest and bowed his head slightly. He was thinking about the library. He was thinking about the kids. He had one. Asterisk, the noise in the town square was deafening, but Elias felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He held the giant cardboard check in his hands. It felt heavy, not because of the paper it was printed on, but because of what it represented. He looked out at the crowd. People were clapping, some were whistling, and he even saw a few older women wiping tears from their eyes with their handkerchiefs. It was as if the whole town had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to just be real, and finally they could exhale. Elias didn't jump up and down. He didn't shout. He just looked at the people and nodded his head slowly, a humble gesture of thanks. He saw the children from the neighborhood jumping up and down near the front, their smiles wide and bright. He thought about the dusty shelves in the school library. He thought about new books with fresh, crisp pages. He thought about computers that actually worked. The money was going to do so much good. That was the real prize. The reporter from the news station pushed through the crowd, her cameraman right behind her. She shoved the microphone into Elias's face. The bright light of the camera made Elias squint. "Elias, you just beat the top chef in the region," she said, her voice full of excitement. "How does it feel? Did you ever think you could win?" Elias looked at the camera lens. It felt like a giant eye staring at him. He swallowed nervously. "I did not come here to win," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I just wanted to make something good. I wanted to help the library. I think food is love. If you love the people you are feeding, the food will taste good." The reporter nodded frantically, looking for a soundbite. "And what do you have to say to Chef Victor? He was very hard on you. He mocked your cooking." Elias looked past the lights to the back of the tent. Victor was there, standing in the shadows near his empty station. The famous chef looked like a ghost. His white uniform was still perfect, but his shoulders were slumped. He looked smaller than he had that morning. "I have nothing bad to say about him," Elias said gently. "He is a very skilled man. He knows many things I do not know. Maybe one day he will see that simple food has power too." The reporter pulled the microphone back, looking surprised. She probably wanted a fight. She wanted Elias to say something mean so people would watch the news. But Elias wasn't angry. He was just grateful. She turned the camera off for a moment. "That was beautiful," she said quietly to Elias. While Elias was being congratulated by the organizers, the crowd began to thin out near the judges' table. Victor was standing alone. His assistants had packed up his expensive tools and left. They didn't want to be around when the cameras stopped rolling. They knew their boss was in a bad mood. He stood with his arms hanging by his sides, staring at the spot where his masterpiece of a dish had sat. It was gone now, eaten, but not finished. The judges had barely touched it. He felt like a fool. He looked at his hands that had won awards and cooked for presidents. Today, those hands had made a plate that was called empty.
Ow.
The words of the head judge echoed in his mind. Asterisk, it does not nourish. It does not comfort, asterisk. Victor looked up and saw the crowd gathered around Elias. He saw them hugging the old man, patting him on the back. He saw the genuine warmth in their eyes. No one had ever looked at Victor like that. People looked at Victor with fear, or with envy, or with greed, because they wanted to know his secrets. But they never looked at him with love. A heavy weight settled in his chest. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a genius. He felt like a fraud. He realized that all the gold dust and foam in the world couldn't replace a mother's recipe. He had forgotten why he started cooking in the first place. He had gotten so lost in the art that he forgot about the food. Slowly, hesitantly, Victor walked out of the shadows. His steps were heavy. He walked toward Elias. The crowd saw him coming and went quiet. The protective circle around Elias tightened. People looked at Victor with suspicion. They remembered how rude he had been. They remembered the names he had called the janitor. Elias saw Victor approaching. He stopped talking to a little girl and turned around. He saw the famous chef walking toward him. Victor didn't look proud anymore. He looked humble. His head was down. Victor stopped a few feet away from Elias. The two men stood there for a moment. The silence stretched out, tight and nervous. Everyone waited. Was he going to yell? Was he going to demand a recount? Then Victor did something that shocked everyone more than the contest result. He took off his tall white hat. He held it in his hands, twisting the brim, Victor said. His voice was rough, like he had a lump in his throat. I owe you an apology." The crowd whispered. No one expected this. "I was arrogant," Victor continued, looking at the ground. "I was cruel. I thought that because I have expensive things and a famous name, I was better than you. I was wrong." He looked up, and his eyes were red. The judges were right. My dish was cold. It was showing off. Your dish. It had life in it. I tasted it. I know why they chose you." Elias stood quietly. He didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant. He just listened. "I lost my way," Victor said, his voice cracking just a little. "I forgot that food is about people. I treated it like a competition for my ego. You treated it like a gift. Thank you for reminding me what real cooking is." It was a profound moment. The bully had been defeated not by force but by truth, and in his defeat he found his dignity again. Elias stepped forward. He reached out his hand. It was a worker's hand, rough and calloused. He didn't hold it out with pride, but with peace. "It is okay," Elias said. "We all get lost sometimes. The important thing is to find your way back." Victor took Elias's hand. The famous chef and the simple janitor shook hands in the middle of the town square. The flash of cameras went off like crazy, capturing the moment. The crowd applauded again, but this time it was softer. It was a clap of respect for both men. Victor didn't let go of Elias's hand immediately. He looked into the old man's eyes. "Can I ask you something?" Victor asked. "As one cook to another?" Elias nodded. "Of course, would you teach me?" Victor asked. "Not how to make the stew. I know I can learn that. But would you teach me how to cook like you? How to feel the food? I have all the technique in the world, but I have no heart." "I want to learn heart." Elias was surprised. He looked at Victor, really looked at him, and saw a man who was hurting. He saw a man who was tired of being famous but unknown. "I am no teacher," Elias said. "I just follow my nose. But if you want to come to my kitchen on Sunday, you can help me peel potatoes. We start at 6 in the morning." Victor actually smiled. A real smile. "I will be there. With my own peeler." The two men separated. Victor walked back to his station, but his walk was different now. It was lighter. He started packing his things with care instead of anger. He treated his expensive pots with respect again, but not as idols. They were just tools now. Elias turned back to the check. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. He was tired. His feet hurt from standing all day. His back ached from the tension, but his heart was full. The sun was starting to set over the town square. The shadows grew long, painting the ground in orange and gold. The event was winding down. People were leaving, talking excitedly about the stew, talking about the upset of the century. But the story wasn't really about the stew anymore. It was about the connection between two different worlds. It was about the bridge that had been built between a high tower of ego and a simple garden of love. As the lights of the square flickered on, Elias felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He had won the money for the library, yes, but he had also done something else. He had made a friend. And that, Elias thought, was the best recipe of all. The weeks that followed the contest were a whirlwind for Elias, but not in the way he had expected. He didn't become a television star. He didn't move to a big city or hire an agent. In fact, he refused almost every interview request that came his way. The reporters wanted him to talk trash about Victor or sell his story for a movie, but Elias wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in keeping his promise. On a bright Tuesday morning, Elias walked into the principal's office at the local elementary school. He was wearing his usual work pants and a clean button-up shirt. In his hand, he held an envelope. Inside was the check for $5,000. He handed it to the principal, a tired woman named Mrs. Gable, who had been fighting for years to get the library renovated. For the books, Elias said simply, and maybe some new computers. Mrs. Gable looked at the check, then up at Elias. Her eyes filled with tears. She knew Elias as the quiet man who sometimes fixed the locks in the hallway. She didn't know he was the cook from the news until now. "You did this?" she asked. "For us." "The children need stories," Elias said, looking away shyly. "Stories take them places." The library was transformed within a month. Old, dusty carpets were ripped out and replaced with bright, clean flooring. Fresh paint covered the scuff marks on the walls. Best of all, 2 tall bookshelves arrived, packed with new books' adventure stories. History books, picture books for the little ones. The room smelled of paper and glue instead of mildew. When the kids saw the new books, their faces lit up. They ran their fingers over the covers, treating them like treasure. Elias watched from the doorway, a small smile on his face. He had never seen money spent so well. He felt lighter, as if a heavy stone had been lifted off his back. But life did not go back to exactly how it was before. There was a new addition to Elias's routine, Every Sunday morning at 6 o'clock, the doorbell to Ilias's small apartment would ring. When he opened it, Victor would be standing there. It was a strange sight. The famous chef, dressed in expensive jeans and a leather jacket, holding a bag of vegetables he had bought from the market. He looked tired, but he looked happy. "Good morning, Elias," Victor would say. "Come in," Elias would reply. "The coffee is hot." The kitchen in Elias's apartment was tiny. There was barely enough room for one person to turn around, let alone two grown men. But they made it work. There was no fancy equipment here. There was an old gas stove that clicked loudly when you lit it, and a wooden table that wobbled if you leaned on it too hard. At first, things were awkward. Victor was used to giving orders in a loud voice. He tried to organize Elisa's kitchen, lining up the spices in alphabetical order and trying to dice the onions into perfect. Tiny squares. Elias watched him for a few minutes, shaking his head. "No, no," Elias said gently. He reached over and took the knife from Victor's hand. "You are fighting the onion. You are trying to control it. You must work with it." "I have to control it," Victor argued, frustrated. "If the pieces are not the same size, they cook at different rates." "We are not making a magazine cover," Elias said, handing Victor a peeler. "We are making lunch. Peel the carrots, and do not peel them so thin. Leave some of the skin on. That is where the flavor is." Victor looked at the carrot like it was an alien object. He was used to peeling every bit of roughness away until the vegetable was a smooth, pale cylinder. Elias wanted him to leave the dirt, the imperfections. It went against everything Victor had learned in culinary school. "Trust me," Elias said, so Victor trusted him. He peeled the carrots roughly. He chopped the celery. He washed the lettuce. As the weeks went by, the tension in Victor's shoulders began to disappear. He stopped wearing his expensive watch on Sundays because he didn't want to get it wet. He stopped looking at his phone. He learned to listen to the sound of the water boiling and the smell of the garlic hitting the oil. They cooked simple meals: tomato soup, roast chicken with lemon, potatoes roasted in the pan juices. They didn't use saffron or gold dust. They used salt, pepper, and thyme. One Sunday, while they were eating a stew similar to the one from the contest, Victor put down his spoon. "I had a dream last night," Victor said. Elias looked up from his bowl. "A bad dream?" "No, a good one," Victor said. "I was in my restaurant, but it was different. The menu was simple. Just 10 dishes. All made with ingredients from local farms. No foam, no tweezers. I was cooking and people were smiling. They weren't taking pictures of the food. They were just eating." Elias nodded. "That sounds like a good dream." "I am going to do it," Victor said. "I am going to change the restaurant. The investors will be angry. They like the fancy food because it costs a lot of money. But I don't care. I want to cook like this. I want to cook food that makes people feel like they are home." "It is a risk," Elias said. "It is," Victor agreed. "But watching you win that day, it showed me that I was a slave to my own ego. I was cooking for myself, to prove how smart I was. You cook for others, to make them happy. I want to be like you, Elias." Elias reached across the small table and patted Victor's hand. "You do not have to be like me. You are a great chef. Just be a chef who cares." A few months later, the news broke. Victor announced he was closing his famous restaurant for a month to reimagine the menu. Food critics went crazy. They wrote articles predicting the end of his career. They said he was having a breakdown, but when he reopened, the silence was deafening. The waiters were no longer wearing suits. They wore casual clothes. The tablecloths were gone, revealing the wood underneath. And the menu? It was 1 page long. It featured simple, rustic dishes: roasted beets with goat cheese, grilled fish with herbs, bread and butter. The reviews came in a week later. They were not confused anymore. They were glowing. "Finally, Victor is cooking with his heart," one famous critic wrote. "He has stopped trying to impress us and started trying to feed us. It is the best meal of the year." Victor didn't take all the credit. In interviews, when they asked him where his inspiration came from, he told them the story. He told them about a contest he lost and a man who taught him that a peeled carrot is more soul than a gold leaf. Elias heard about the interviews through the grapevine. He was happy for his friend. He continued his job as a janitor at the university. He still swept the floors and cleaned the bathrooms. The students still rushed past him, mostly unaware that the quiet man with the broom was a local hero. But sometimes, things were different. One winter afternoon, Elias was eating his lunch in the break room, a sandwich he had made at home. A young student, a girl who looked stressed and tired, walked in. She sat down across from him and stared at her phone. She looked like she was about to cry. Elias looked at her. He remembered the feeling of being young and overwhelmed. Without thinking, he reached into his lunch bag and pulled out a Tupperware container. Inside were a few homemade cookies. They were simple oatmeal cookies, nothing fancy. He pushed the container across the table toward her. The girl looked up, startled. "What? Oh no, I couldn't." "Please," Elias said. "I made too many. Take them." She hesitated, then took one. She bit into it. Her eyes closed. She chewed slowly, and the tension in her face melted away. She took a deep breath. "Oh my God," she said. This tastes like my grandma used to make." "Thank you," Elias smiled. It was a small moment, just two people in a break room. But to Elias, it was everything. It didn't matter if he had a TV show or a famous restaurant. He had the power to make someone feel better with just a few ingredients and a little bit of care. That evening, Elias walked home through the falling snow. He passed a bookstore window and saw a display of cookbooks. There, in the center, was a new book. The cover photo was simpler pot of stew on a wooden table with a rough piece of bread next to it. The title was *The Simple Kitchen. Recipes from a Humble Friend*. The author's name was Victor Dode. Elias smiled and kept walking. He wasn't jealous. He was proud. He thought about the kids reading their new books at the library. He thought about his next cooking lesson with Victor on Sunday. He thought about the student who ate the cookie. Life wasn't about being the best or the richest. It wasn't about gold dust or fancy hats. It was about showing up. It was about kindness. It was about stirring the pot with love, no matter who was watching. Elias put his hands in his pockets and hummed a soft tune as he walked toward his small apartment, ready to boil some water for tea. The world was noisy and fast, but in his kitchen, everything was just right.